Hey guys.
Hey, hey.
Hey,
New cast. Steve and I are joining, and David and Jonah have remained. They are remnants, if you will, from the previous. Okay, well, that was really long, but it was 1,000 words shorter than Clinton's first speech. So, credit where credit's due on that.
But
Also,
1 minute shorter.
also historical, having two women behind a president at a State of the Union, or whatever we want to call these, the joint session speeches. Although I found myself like I wanted to be excited about the historic nature of that, but instead found myself looking forward to when it's not historic, if that makes sense. Where it's just like, yeah, there's chicks. What are you going to do?
That's my attitude now.
All right. Well, Jonah, you talked about, some of your expectations, et cetera, before the speech. Lay it out.
Yeah, so I basically think my predictions were right. He steered, it was with a few exceptions and fairly modest by recent history standards. There was very little rancor in it. No mention of abortion. The references to culture war-y type things were kept at a minimum, particularly if you're not deeply versed in these kinds of issues, so that you understood what he was really saying has a culture war component to it. If you're a normal American just watching this, you thought this was pretty much without rancor for the most part. With the one part where like the millionaires and billionaires stuff, I thought went into class warfare in a rancorous way. And I would argue, open to correction on this, that even including the Obama years, this was the most pro-government, most confident in the ability of government to do things, most in favor of expanding government presidential address, whether State of the Union or whatever we're supposed to call these things, in our lifetimes. And because the exception, Obama did some of this stuff too, but when Obama did it, it was much more poetic and about us working together, and we are the ones we're waiting for. At least that's the way I remember it. This was like straightforward 1940s, 1950s style program, government spending. And it was remarkable in that regard.
David, Ted Cruz called it boring but radical.
Well, I mean, I find almost all these things boring. So fact check true on part one. I mean, part two, radical. I'm going to say, look, I mean, essentially what I saw was a person who was optimistic about America, which is a very, I'm sort of used to the best politicians on the right and in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, both being optimistic about America, but their optimism manifesting itself in different ways. The optimism about America of the GOP in the before times, the wonders of the private sector and the energy and vitality of the American people. And just, we need to liberate them to work their magic. And the optimism of the Democrats is this: look at what we will accomplish together through these fantastic government programs that we're going to design and fund that will take us to the next level. And that was, it felt, as Jonah said, like old school Democrat. It felt like pre-culture war Democrat in a way. And it was, but that with several extra zeros at the end of the numbers. So that's the part that felt much more radical to me, is just the sheer scope and the sheer scale of it all, to the point where something like that would be a pretty big development, say national free community college nationally, is like a rounding error of the whole program. And so from that sense, yeah, I would agree there are elements of this that are radical in just the sheer scope and scale of it all. But on the other hand, it felt very familiar. It felt very normal if you just rewind the clock a little bit.
Steve, I assume you don't think this speech changed any hearts or minds, but do you think it sent any hearts or minds into their, battle ready positions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I agree with almost everything that David and Jonah said. I do think this was a pretty radical speech. I mean, if you think about the introduction of the American Family Plan tonight, $1.8 trillion, and you think we're not quite 4 months into, not 100 days into the Biden administration, that's the third largest spending proposal that Joe Biden has had in his first 100 days. You had 1.9 trillion in COVID relief plus, you had 2.2 trillion in infrastructure plus that he's proposed, and now we have an additional 1.8 trillion. There is no sense that we really have that there's got to be any sacrifice, or that the part of this coming together that he spent a lot of time talking about in his inaugural and was virtually absent, I thought, from this speech, requires any common sacrifice, or that we're going to come up with serious ways to pay this. I think he soft pedaled the class war stuff. I think Jonah's right about that, but it's totally unrealistic. We are not going to pay for what Joe Biden is proposing by taxing only the wealthy and corporations. It's not going to happen. You could confiscate the wealth of all of the richest Americans, and it wouldn't come close to paying for what he's proposing right now. And that's just struck me as very unrealistic. I think if you go back and you think about the things that animated Joe Biden's inaugural address, it was about unity. The whole thing was about unity. We're going to do this together. We can't do these difficult things we have in front of us unless we do them together. It requires us to work together. He said, today on this January day, my whole soul is in this, bringing America together, uniting our people and uniting our nation. There were 14 different mentions of unity or uniting in his inaugural address. That was virtually absent from this speech. He had a nice sort of tip of the cap to Mitch McConnell. He talked about how he hopes to have fruitful discussions with Republicans on infrastructure, sort of not really referencing the fact that he didn't do this on COVID relief, and then ended by saying, after an hour of pretty significant, I would say radical proposals for the expansion of government, ends by saying, this will all work if we're unified. Didn't give much. Look, I mean, the counter case is he won, Democrats won. This is, I think, a larger version, but consistent with what he was proposing. So this is what you get to do.
I want to get to questions, but I want to get each of your reactions to the Scott speech as well. Let me tell you my thesis, which is going to rile up our dispatchers watching this. So just prepare yourselves, trigger warning. The Scott speech, and the reason that all of y'all liked it so much was because it was the Republican Party from circa 2000, actually more like 1999, like compassionate conservatism. There's no one standing behind Scott. No one's following that. He doesn't represent the Republican Party. So while you may have liked the speech, it's a one-off. And so it was sort of fun to listen to, like, throwback, kind of like occasionally I don't mind disco, but disco's not coming back. All right. Tell me why I'm wrong. David?
First, I love it when you go full Sarah. It's just fantastic.
Never we love it when Sarah. You go full Sarah.
I was just about to send a tweet into the ether, basically, like, if this is the GOP that emerges from the fratricide, I'm in. And then I thought,
no doubt
that even saying if this is the GOP that emerges might be wildly optimistic. But let me just say this. I mean, as a response, it was a good response, and it was good in a couple of ways. I thought it was good in that he didn't set it up as saying Joe Biden is wrong on everything. He was setting it up as saying, we want to meet Joe Biden on some things, and he doesn't want to meet us. And there are things that we want to accomplish, and he doesn't want to work with us. He wants to go his own way. And I thought that was an effective response. And then, Tim Scott's just a good guy. Like, he's just a likable, good guy, and it shines through. And I think that he had an advantage in following a presidential speech that didn't have all of the pageantry of the packed galleries and the thunderous applause and all of that, because you always seem so much smaller compared to all of that. But then when you're following a social distanced and masked event where the applause, even where people are trying to yell and trying to really rouse it up, it's tepid. I felt like the staging worked to his advantage, that it wasn't such a dramatic contrast. And I understand, Sarah, you can't out cynic me on the future of the GOP. But if it could be that future, stop shaking your head. If it could be that future, I would be very happy.
We all shared our favorite Larson cartoons today on our dispatch, like, internal employee Slack channel. And mine was the two spiders who built the web over the child's slide and said, if we could pull this off, we'll eat like kings. That's what I think of what you just said. Yeah, sure. Yeah, you will. You'll eat like kings if you catch a child coming down the swing with a spider web.
So
Jonah?
I think look, we live in a time where cynicism is always warranted. And
I think it's skepticism.
It's skepticism too, despair, schadenfreude. I mean, pick a whole bunch of negative adjectives and verbs, and they're all justified. We're only minutes away from the living envying the dead. So I'm with you, but I think there's a factor, and this is a complicated thing to sort of convey succinctly, but I think there is a thing about the right that is not well understood in American politics, both because of the cognitive dissonance of the left and the lack of self-awareness of parts of the right. And that is, Black politicians are remarkably popular on the right if they're Republicans. The two most popular are two of the most popular figures in the Tea Party were Ben Carson and Herman Cain, precisely because there were large numbers of right-wingers who very much, they don't like to admit it, but it really bothers them when people say that they're racist. And they like someone who they can support, who they can say, see, it's not because I'm racist, it's because I disagree with Barack Obama or whatever. I like this guy because I agree with him and all that. And I think that is a much more compelling and powerful part of right-wing psychology than a lot of people appreciate. And so, well, yes, I don't think Tim Scott is going to usher us into compassionate conservatism 2.0 of the Bush variety. At the same time, I think his popularity on big chunks of the right is underappreciated for a lot of those kinds of reasons, because there's an implicit own the libsness to it, where you can say all the left wants to do is say everybody who's right wing, everyone's Republican is a racist. You say, how can I be a racist? I'm supporting Tim Scott. Or how can I be a racist? Ben Carson was my first pick. And I'm not saying that people don't affirmatively like Tim Scott on the merits, but that's an X factor that kind of gives him a better shot in all of this politically going forward than it would have been if Marco Rubio had said almost word for word the same thing, or someone like Marco Rubio.
Steve.
Yeah, I think tonally you're right. Tonally, it's a throwback to a different era of Republicanism. I don't necessarily think that was the case based on the substance of what he said. I mean, he had a long section there about criminal justice reform. Many of these proposals are relatively new, or at least relatively new, to be endorsed and embraced by Republicans. On the tone,
I just want to fact check that really quickly, because I don't want to be off, but I believe that the crack cocaine disparity was ended during the beginning of the W administration.
Yeah, I mean, there may be specific points that he made that didn't apply, but the broad argument he made, I think, was based on the legislation that he proposed last year and grew out.
I just meant that criminal justice reform was very much part of compassionate conservatism.
Oh, yeah. I think these are a sort of a new set of issues. I'll concede that to you and make the point on tone. I think the point on tone is, even in the sections of his speech where he was focused on what we might call culture war issues. He did it in a way that wasn't the kind of outrage bait we're used to. He actually made an argument, and it was a coherent, cohesive case. Walked people through, made I think a consistent case against some of the excesses that we've seen from the woke left, calling them out, but putting them in their proper context. So I thought he was very effective. I don't think it's necessarily a throwback. And look, part of the debate about what's happening in the conservative movement, what's happening in the Republican Party, is going to be about people like Tim Scott versus people like Josh Hawley, or people like Tim Scott versus people like Ted Cruz. I don't think it's fair to say Tim Scott represents the past and these guys represent the angry present or the angry future. You're going to have people like Tim Scott making good arguments about the future of the Republican Party, which I think is in part what he was trying to lay out here.
So can I just point out one quick thing? Since you're talking about throwbacks, I thought this was the most interesting tweet of the night. Jason Miller, who we don't have to dilate on his
who was he? Who was
manifest flaws. Advisor to Donald Trump, still an advisor to Donald Trump, pugnacious figure to be sure. He tweeted, "Tonight is the greatest act of political plagiarism since Joe Biden ripped off Neil Kinnock." And clearly saying that, he retweeted it around the time of some of that Buy America, America First stuff and all that kind of thing. He's basically conceding that Joe Biden's big government, big liberalism, government can do it all stuff was ripped off from Donald Trump. And that's just an interesting thing for him to sort of throw out there, which, as someone who likes the Tim Scott stuff, I think is kind of interesting and telling. But anyway, I just want to
I did go through about the first 50 to 60% of it, of the Biden speech, wondering where is he off from where the nationalist right is?
Mm-hmm.
Like, legit, where is he off? I mean, is there a view, well, we're 80% there and he's irresponsible by adding on the extra 20%? I mean, is that it? Because a lot of it seemed to be very much resonating with a ton of the quote new right economic rhetoric.
Right, but Biden doesn't want to own the libs, which is the key distinction.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference is who gets to define common good.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And motivation, why you're doing it. All right, question time. David, this is to you and me from Benjamin. Did you yell at your screen when he said,
I know what this is.
Fire in a crowded theater?
Correct.
I was trying to look for the right sort of triggered GIF to send out to the world when that happened.
I like Declan's. Declan had the West Wing one where Bartlett's banging his head against the Resolute desk.
That's good.
I thought that was good.
Yeah,
it was not in the speech. Jonah, you noted this. It was an ad lib, and you said you weren't sure whether that made it better or worse. I mean, it definitely makes it better than if a whole team of speechwriters researched it. It went through White House counsel's office. It went through domestic policy shop. Yeah. And they were like, no problem.
So we have to explain, though, why
but
it
I
is
get your
that
point.
Why it is that is so triggering. It comes from, it's a phrase that is absolutely used all the time to try to justify restrictions on the First Amendment. And it comes from a case called Schenck versus United States, where the Supreme Court permitted the jailing of a man who distributed anti-war literature, calling for peaceful resistance to the draft in World War I, created a standard for speech, restricting speech, allowing the government to restrict speech when it saw a clear and present danger to the speech, and compared the peaceful leafleting of anti-war speech to shouting fire in a crowded theater. It is the worst case to bring up regarding protection of individual, or one of the worst, regarding protection of individual liberties. And so you saw sort of the vanishing, dwindling number of consistent First Amendment advocates on Twitter kind of spontaneously combust when that statement was uttered.
Well, also, I mean, we should add, it was said in the context of Second Amendment stuff.
The Second Amendment.
And what drives me crazy is this thing that he said, which you hear all the time, and it's true. No amendment is absolute, right? And put aside the fact that there are plenty of amendments that the left thinks are absolutely absolute, right? I mean, the 13th Amendment, I don't know. You can come up with a couple. But no one ever says no amendment is absolute, or almost no one. No, I would put it this way. The only time you hear people say no amendment is absolute is precisely when they want to violate the Constitution, right? They say no amendment is absolute, which is true. And then they propose something that is actually covered by the amendment pretty squarely. But they want to sort of, they think this is like an incantation. If you say it, that means the amendment is just null and void. And it's incredibly annoying. But
Steve, we have a very clever viewer named Tom. Tom has noticed, I think, that our curtains are quite similar to one another. Tom says, Sarah and Steve are both traveling, ... They're clearly in the same hotel. Any sneak peek for us as to what the dispatch is up to?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm actually sitting in Caleb's room right now, so there's nothing.
Ooh, turn the camera so we can see Caleb.
He's producing this from the bathroom. This is very high.
Producing what from the bathroom? Sorry,
This
go
is
on.
our fancy setup. We are,
Oh,
I
Jonah.
think we can give a quick preview. We are here in Dallas to record an interview tomorrow morning with President Bush on his new book on immigration and on what's happening in the world. Undoubtedly, we'll talk to him about the speech tonight. So excited to be here. Interview tomorrow morning, and we will post that, I believe, Friday.
And for those of you who heard my rant some weeks ago that my husband did not bring me back Torchy's queso, I picked a hotel that is next to the Dallas Torchy's, and we're just gonna like eat so much queso after the interview. Steve doesn't even know that yet, but it's gonna be breakfast tacos and queso for hours.
You're not going to get an argument from a Wisconsin guy about eating a lot of cheese.
Steve, it's the best queso in the country.
I saw Jonah
right.
roll his
eyes. This is from Faith, and it's a really interesting question to me, and because I don't know y'all's answer to it. Should Republicans embrace paid family leave? Why or why not? I actually thought the best part of Biden's speech, by the way, it's just, it was a very small part of it, but 2 million women have been pushed out of the workforce by COVID because a lack of childcare or elder care has forced them to quit their jobs and stay home. I thought he did a really nice job laying out the case for some of those proposals that he had. But to Faith's question specifically, should the GOP embrace paid family leave? Jonah?
To me, it's mostly a wonky question of can we afford it? Does it actually make sense? I'm sympathetic to the problem. I would rather it be handled on a more sort of local case by case kind of basis. I think that it should be one of those things that there's room in the GOP to be on either side on. There's some things that you're supposed to be these like straight line litmus test things to be in the GOP. I think this is one of these things that you could sort of be. There should be some room for some policy innovation on. I do think though, and this does remind me, Tim Scott was very smart in bringing up the stuff about school closures, which Biden was very squirrely on, and one of the reasons that those 2 million women had to leave because they didn't have childcare and whatnot, or maybe not those 2 million women, but why lots of women left the workforce was because the schools were closed. And, one of the things that you will come to appreciate when the brisket's a little older is what some economists talk about when they talk about schools is, to be blunt, the prison effect. It's just they take your kids away from you for a little while to let you be a productive member of the economy. And the fact that he didn't have any triangulation against teachers unions, against the way the schools have behaved, I think was a sign that he just believes in all the good things, and all the good things have no cost. And so his approach to family leave, I don't trust, but I haven't studied the economics of it in a long time, so I'm punting a little bit on it.
There was a really interesting article this week. I'm trying to find it, but oh, here we go. It's a Politico article from April 26th. Kids are finally returning to school, but most of them are white. And the statistics in it were just, I mean, horrible. I think the word would be horrible. I mean, basically, if you are not a white student, the chances of you, 52% of white fourth graders were back in public schools full time by the end of February. 54 and 69% of Black, Hispanic, and Asian fourth graders, 54% to 69%, were enrolled in full-time remote instruction at that point. I mean, a huge racial disparity in how schools are coming back and what parents feel comfortable sending their kids back. You know, the paid family leave thing,
Can I ask a question? I haven't read the article, but it's a straight up factual question. How much of that is explained by the fact that most of the schools that haven't reopened are big city, inner city schools, which are disproportionately Black and Hispanic, versus suburban schools, which have reopened at a much faster rate, which are disproportionately, white? I mean, because I mean, just what is the explanation for that disparity?
It looks like it's a little complicated. It's not just that, although obviously that's a huge factor. It's also that some of those parents, white parents, feel more comfortable sending their kids back to school, it sounds like. Whereas even in schools that are open, you are more likely to get white kids back than the non-white kids in the same school.
That's interesting. I mean, it's not evidence of structural racism, as far as I can tell from this fact pattern, right? Because it's something else going on there, but it's interesting.
I would vote for more childcare tax credit money. Like if I had to pick between paid family leave and childcare tax credit, in terms of what we as taxpayers should be funding in terms of incentivizing various behaviors, it seems to me that, growing the economy by having childcare be a lot easier. I mean, I'd like both, but that's sort of where my head is. David?
So, to get wonky about it, so there was actually a really interesting paper published at the end of October 2019. It's one of the first things I wrote about at when I joined the Dispatch, and it's a result of 15 years of data about California's 2004 Paid Family Leave Act what they found was, and this is interesting, there was very little evidence that family leave increased women's employment, wage earnings, or attachment to employers. There was a little bit less employment for new mothers and a little bit lower wages moving down the line. And part of the reason for that is that, interestingly enough, paid family leave did two things at once. It tended to reduce fertility, the number of children born, but increase the amount of time that moms spent with the kids that they had. So it was a very interesting sort of finding of sort of the real world effect of it, is that it was fewer children, moms spend more time with the children, but no real meaningful impact on overall employment earnings or attachment to employers. So take that for what it's worth. It's one of the reasons I think why one of the benefits to a federal system. California is an immense economy, and one of the top 10 largest economies in the world, and they implemented paid family leave 17 years ago. And maybe it's not as well designed as some programs could be, maybe not as maybe there are defects in the policy, but I bet that's not the results that people were thinking they were going to get when it was enacted in 2004. Which is another reminder, I think, and very worth saying in the aftermath of a discussion of huge government programs that are designed to have particular effects. And not to put on my limited government conservative hat again, the intended effects are not always the effects or all of the effects that you get from major technocratic government innovations.
All right. A quick lightning round, and then we'll wrap this up. Steve, to you, from Dominic. What if Democrats were honest and proposed a middle-class tax hike in return for European social benefits?
It wouldn't be very popular. I think that's why we haven't seen this. Look, I mean, Joe Biden back in, I think it was May of 2020, maybe in March of 2020, made this pledge. Basically, your taxes are not going to be raised if you make less than $400,000. Period. Bingo. He said as a punctuation on the point. And depending on all sorts of analyses of what he's proposed already on the actual impact to taxpayers, but the Tax Policy Center found that middle class taxpayers between roughly 50,000 and 90,000 annual income are going to have a slight tax increase. It was $250, $300 or something. So if that's the case, Joe Biden will have broken his pledge. But there's a reason that he's saying we're going to do all of this stuff, trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of spending, and you don't have to pay for it. These guys have to pay for it. And that's because it's popular. It's sort of the oldest trick in the book.
Jonah, we talked about the census on the dispatch earlier today, and then in the green room afterward, I was bummed that we didn't get to hear your rant on expanding the House of Representatives, and so I'm taking a point of personal privilege, and that's my question from the comments.
Okay.
How many do you want it to be? What, bleh, the House already sucks. How is this going to make it better?
Okay, so where to begin? First of all, the first piece I ever got published was in the Wall Street Journal in 1992 on why we need to expand the House of Representatives. It has been my spirit animal for my entire professional career as a writer.
In 1992, roughly how many people were there in a district? There's 700,000 now. There's more than 700,000 in a district now. Was it the same?
Yeah, it was like 500 and something thousand, something like that. So look, first of all, the only time that George Washington spoke at the Constitutional Convention was to chastise the delegates for contemplating having districts with 40,000 members. And he told them they had to have 30,000 members because 40,000 was just way too big. And people forget that the original First Amendment was not all that stuff about religion and speech and whatever. It was about making sure that the districts stayed proportional, and it got lost in paperwork or fax machines or something. The basic argument, there are a bunch of different arguments, but one of the core ones is that, with technology and all that, it's easier to have bigger districts than you had in 1789 or 1790 or whatever. But still, there is no sense in which congressional district that a member of the community actually feels like they have a real relationship with their congressperson on a general basis. And if you think gerrymandering is bad, very difficult to gerrymander. The gerrymandering becomes more difficult the smaller the district is, for the simple reason that you can't draw weirder and weirder lines. It's going to get smaller. Let's put it this way. You can't gerrymander a district of one person, right? Because that one person represents that one person perfectly. And as you move out, the communities that it's represented are more coherent and representative of their views, until you get so large that then it becomes easy to stitch together different blocks of voters. So it'd be an antidote against gerrymandering and that kind of thing. The main arguments against it are that, it'd be very difficult to have meaningful debate, like we have that now. It'd be unwieldy. Well, look, NASDAQ makes trillions of decisions just in a nanosecond. We've learned from Zooming that you don't have to be in the room. The House of Commons in the UK has been standing room only for generations. They don't, there aren't enough seats. Who gives a rat's ass? But the smaller you make districts, the more you'll have voters who feel like their politicians actually represent them, that they're actually doing the job that the House is supposed to do, which is being the most democratic branch of the democratic part of the legislature and of the government. And it would just be really fun and interesting to have like the crowd scene from Ben-Hur in Congress. So I'm not saying 7,000, but maybe 1,500, something like that. Right now, I think the New Hampshire lower house or whatever that the representative body is, almost the same number of representatives as Congress does.
Oh,
That's
no, I
crazy.
think they have more.
They okay, more. So like you could handle making it a little bigger or a lot bigger.
Take the
And,
Verizon Center by eminent domain.
There you go.
All right. I'm getting messages from Caleb. He is not enjoying being trapped in the bathroom with Steve taking over his room. He wants out. So this is the last question. It's coming from Daniel. David, it's all yours. Noticeable references to VP Harris several times during the speech. What's the likelihood that you put it that Biden runs in 2024?
Medium. I mean, it all depends on how his health. I mean, it's, likelihood 50%. I don't know. I mean, it's,
Bold prediction.
He's advancing years. If he can, he's going to do it. Like if he can, he's going to do it. I don't think he's going to, if he feels up to it, I don't think he's going to step aside.
All right. You've got to do at least 51% that he
51% that he will. I mean, I think if the country is doing well, if he's got a good case to make for re-election, he should go for it. I think it would put the Democrats at a disadvantage if he didn't do that. In my view, that's why I think if you're gonna make me choose, but a lot
I think
of
it's
miles
well
to
over
walk.
50% that he'll run again because Democrats would be at such a disadvantage if he didn't. All right. With that, thank you guys so much, as always, for joining. We love doing these with y'all. And what better excuse than a joint session of Congress? And Caleb, you can come out of the bathroom. Congratulations. Good night, y'all.
Sure.